What do I do as a senator if a batch of nominees arrives for a vote and I support 58 of them, but I don't support 2 of them? If I vote no, then I've voted against 58 qualified people. If I vote yes, then I've given my consent, possibly, for deeply dangerous people to staff key federal agencies. It makes no logical sense to do this, at the very least, in this open-ended way. But it does make sense if you put yesterday's decision in context. Because Senate Republicans increasingly view themselves as mere employees of their party's leader, Donald Trump. They will look the other way when he violates the law, and when he asks to consolidate power, his employees grant his request without thinking twice.
Democracies rarely collapse overnight. They erode piece by piece. In a fiery Senate floor speech, Senator Chris Murphy sounded the alarm, accusing Congress of surrendering its constitutional role and sleepwalking into authoritarian rule. From judicial independence to media freedom, and now the Senate's advice and consent powers, Murphy says the warning lights are flashing red. Is he right, or is this political exaggeration? Let's break it down.
Mr. President, I'd first note that we are all horrified watching images and following the news out of Utah, and we are sending all of our thoughts to Mr. Kirk, to his family, to survivors there. Mr. President, colleagues, there are a host of ways that democracies die. Institutions like universities and the legal profession, they capitulate to the leader, to the regime. They stop being forums for free speech and dissent. The legal system becomes perverted into a vehicle to punish opponents of the regime and to immunize loyalists. The press, threatened with sanction or retribution for telling the truth, they fold and they just silence criticism. Business leaders are offered lucrative deals for making loyalty agreements with the government using their economic power then to back the regime. I wish this weren't true, but all of those things are happening in America today. It's why many of us come down to this floor fairly often to talk about our belief that we are sleepwalking into some version of, at best, deeply illiberal democracy where rights and dissent are functionally irrelevant, or at worst, authoritarianism, where political opposition just vanishes. But today I want to talk about another common part of this story about how democracies evaporate, and that's the subjugation of the legislative branch to a corrupt executive branch. Put another way, in healthy democracies, the legislature or the parliament sees itself as a check on runaway executive power. It stands up regularly for its powers, its prerogatives, no matter who the president or the prime minister is. In a disappearing democracy, the legislature effectively operates as an arm of the executive, simply taking orders, including orders to wind down the independent power of the legislature. This is what is happening here, right now, in the United States Senate. One of the most important checks on executive power given to the Senate by the Constitution is the power of consent for nominees to high executive office. It prevents a president from installing in power unqualified or corrupt people. It allows the legislature, and through the legislature, the people, to make sure that the executive branch stays in its lane, executing the law, not making the law. Now, yesterday, we effectively gave that power up in an extraordinary way. Senate Republicans went nuclear. That means they used their majority power to change the rules of the Senate unilaterally without any Democratic support. So that now, in one single vote, the Senate can confirm 50 or 100 or 1,000 Trump nominees all at once. From the founding of our republic until yesterday, without unanimous consent, the Senate voted on one nominee at a time. Now the Senate can batch together dozens or hundreds of nominees in one vote, essentially obliterating our power of advice and consent. Now, Republicans say, well, this was originally a Democratic proposal, but that's not true. Yes, a few Democrats years ago floated a proposal to Republicans to work together in a bipartisan way to batch together 10 nominees at a time, and only lower-level nominees. But this Republican rule, A, involved no consultation with Democrats, B, has no limit, either with respect to how many nominees are considered and seemingly what level of nominee. It would effectively allow, under the actual letter of the rule, for there to be one single vote on an entire slate of cabinet nominees. Now, I understand that the Republican leader will say that that is not the intent of the rule, but read the rule. And there will be pressure, increasing pressure, now that the rules are changed, from the President of the United States to continue to open the aperture of what this rule allows. Now, I will concede that our nomination process is broken, and I'm totally open for reasonable proposals for reform. But this is not reasonable. What do I do as a senator if a batch of nominees arrives for a vote and I support 58 of them, but I don't support 2 of them? If I vote no, then I've voted against 58 qualified people. If I vote yes, then I've given my consent, possibly, for deeply dangerous people to staff key federal agencies. It makes no logical sense to do this, at the very least, in this open-ended way. But it does make sense if you put yesterday's decision in context. Because Senate Republicans increasingly view themselves as mere employees of their party's leader, Donald Trump. They will look the other way when he violates the law, and when he asks to consolidate power, his employees grant his request without thinking twice. Because this wasn't the first time congressional Republicans gladly gave up their power to make Trump's lawlessness easier. Trump has effectively seized the spending power from Congress. This is unforgivable because our founding fathers vested the spending power in Congress because they knew that a president with the unrestrained power of the purse could easily use that authority to seize full power of the government and wrest away from the people control of their government. Trump has frozen or canceled more than $400 billion in congressionally appropriated funding. Senate Republicans have done virtually nothing to counteract that extraordinary, unprecedented seizure of spending power. In fact, they've helped him take control of spending by supporting, for the first time in our nation's history, a partisan rescissions bill that canceled billions of dollars of spending that had been appropriated through a bipartisan vote. Congressional Republicans have also just frankly closed down any meaningful oversight of the corruption that's happening in the executive branch. Now, Republicans enthusiastically rooted through every corner of the Biden administration to find every morsel of alleged corruption that they could find, including harassing virtually every member of the Biden family to find facts to corroborate this bogus Fox News-driven Biden crime family narrative. Meanwhile, Donald Trump and his family have made $3.4 billion off of his presidency. The president is using White House resources, taxpayer-funded White House resources, to market a Trump crypto coin. He bullied a foreign government into giving him a private jet. His family is setting up companies as we speak to profit off government contracts. It's a massive growing corruption racket. But now all of a sudden, Republicans have no interest in oversight. One more example. Another power of the Constitution explicitly reserves for Congress is the power to declare war. The president cannot take military action overseas without Congress, and that's a really good thing. But Republicans have now totally outsourced to Donald Trump the decision as to whether we take military action overseas. Now, I'm not saying that Democrats were perfect in constraining the executive's war powers, but at least we tried. Trump just carried out an airstrike on a boat off the coast of Venezuela, a blatantly illegal act, and there was one single Republican senator who raised a concern. History is full of examples of legislatures where, under pressure from an elected executive who wants to convert a country from democracy to something else like autocracy, they effectively just close up shop. They decide to just take orders from the leader, and thus they consent to this transition. Turkey is no longer a healthy democracy today because the parliament supported consolidating massive new powers in the presidency. In Sri Lanka, their democracy is in peril, in part because their legislature gave up key appointment powers to the executive. Part of the collapse long ago of Russia's short-lived democracy was the Duma's decision to simply view itself as a political arm of the presidency. Now, I know that some people are going to suggest that this is hyperbole. I don't think it is. We are watching a slow-motion daily assault on democracy take place. Institutions are shuttering venues of dissent. The judiciary is being turned into just a mechanism to harass and imprison the president's political opponents. Our media are cutting deals with the president to silence loud critics of the administration. And now, this body will no longer get to vote on individual nominees to the administration who are likely going to carry out this campaign to undermine and eventually potentially destroy the rule of law. None of this is normal. None of this, including what is happening this week in the United States Senate, has any historical precedent before in this country. All of it is wildly dangerous and perhaps fatal if we continue to refuse to join together as Republicans and Democrats to rise to the challenge and protect our democracy.
Senator Chris Murphy's floor speech on the state of American democracy is more than just a critique of one rule change in the Senate. It is a sweeping warning about the slow decay of institutions, the dangers of unchecked executive power, and the complicity of legislators who surrender their responsibilities. To fully appreciate the depth of his warning, one has to see it not simply as a reaction to a partisan maneuver, but as part of a larger story about how democracies decline, both in America and across the world. Murphy's central thesis is that democracies do not usually collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they erode gradually, piece by piece, often under the guise of efficiency or expediency. Universities that were once centers of free thought become cautious and submissive to political pressure. Legal systems that should stand independently as guardians of justice become tools for punishing political opponents and protecting loyalists. The press, once fearless in challenging power, learns to fold under the threat of sanction or intimidation. Business leaders find it easier to cooperate with the government in exchange for favors, abandoning the independence that once allowed them to check state overreach. These slow erosions of civic pillars do not make daily headlines in the same way that wars or crises do, but together they create the conditions for democratic decline. In Murphy's telling, all of these troubling signs are already present in the United States, and they are accelerating. The specific issue that prompted his remarks was a Senate rules change that allows dozens, even hundreds, of executive nominees to be confirmed in a single batch vote. For centuries, the Senate's advice and consent responsibility functioned through individual votes, allowing senators to weigh carefully the qualifications and character of each nominee. This deliberation was not merely tradition, but a constitutional safeguard. The founders entrusted the Senate with this power precisely so that presidents could not stack the government with unqualified or corrupt loyalists. The change may seem technical, but Murphy insists it is profoundly dangerous. Imagine, he says, that a batch of 60 nominees comes before the Senate. 58 are qualified, but 2 are deeply unfit, perhaps corrupt or extreme in their views. A senator who votes no blocks the 58 qualified candidates from serving. A senator who votes yes enables the 2 dangerous nominees to wield power. This all-or-nothing approach undermines the very logic of the Senate's role. What looks like a procedural shortcut is in fact a surrender of scrutiny, a transformation of the Senate into a rubber stamp for the executive. Murphy warns that this kind of concession does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of a broader pattern in which Congress, particularly the Senate, has grown increasingly deferential to the executive branch. Rather than standing as a co-equal branch of government, it risks becoming, in his words, an arm of the executive. And this is precisely how democracies in other parts of the world have declined. In Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan consolidated power after the legislature and judiciary weakened themselves. In Russia, the State Duma became little more than a political arm of the Kremlin, abandoning any meaningful independence. In Sri Lanka, constitutional changes reduced parliamentary power in favor of executive dominance, fueling the instability that later plagued the nation. None of these shifts happened overnight. They were the result of legislatures making compromises, bending the rules, and failing to assert their authority. Murphy fears that the U.S. Senate is now walking the same path. The danger is not only theoretical, it already extends into other areas of congressional authority. Murphy points to the power of the purse as a key example. The Constitution vests spending authority in Congress, recognizing that if presidents controlled both the sword and the purse, they could easily use government resources to entrench themselves in power, reward allies, and punish opponents. Yet in recent years, presidents, and in particular Donald Trump, have seized this authority with little resistance. Trump froze or canceled more than $400 billion in congressionally appropriated funds, a staggering figure that represents a wholesale redirection of constitutional power. Instead of standing up to this usurpation, Senate Republicans largely looked the other way. In some cases, they actively abetted the shift, such as by supporting a partisan rescissions bill, unprecedented in American history, that clawed back billions of dollars already passed in bipartisan budgets. If this becomes normalized, Congress risks becoming irrelevant in budgetary matters, reduced to passing symbolic appropriations that presidents may or may not choose to honor. Oversight, too, has withered. Congress has long wielded investigative authority as one of its sharpest tools to hold the executive accountable. Yet Murphy argues that oversight has become purely partisan. Republicans aggressively probed the Biden administration and the Biden family, often stretching to construct narratives of corruption. But during the Trump years, when evidence of conflicts of interest and profiteering abounded, there was near silence. Murphy cites reports that the Trump family made $3.4 billion off of the presidency, leveraging government connections, branding opportunities, and contracts. He mentions examples of taxpayer-funded resources being used to promote Trump-branded cryptocurrency ventures, allegations of bullying foreign governments into providing personal perks like private jets, and the establishment of family-run companies that profited from government contracts. If even a fraction of these claims are accurate, they represent systemic corruption. Yet the Republican-controlled Senate showed little interest in investigating. The result, Murphy suggests, is that oversight has ceased to function as a check on executive misconduct and now serves only as a political weapon. The erosion extends to war powers. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the authority to declare war, a deliberate check against unilateral presidential military adventurism. Yet, in practice, presidents have increasingly launched military actions without congressional approval, and Congress has failed to reassert itself. Murphy notes that Trump ordered a strike on a Venezuelan vessel without authorization, an act he calls blatantly illegal. Only one Republican senator raised concern. Democrats, too, have sometimes been complicit in allowing war powers to drift to the executive, but Murphy insists that Trump's actions and Congress's indifference represent a new level of disregard for constitutional boundaries. When legislatures abdicate their role in decisions of war and peace, they not only endanger lives but also undermine the fundamental architecture of checks and balances. What ties all these examples together is Murphy's emphasis on trajectory. No single act, no single rules change, no single oversight failure will kill democracy on its own, but together they create momentum. Each new precedent weakens the legislature a little more, empowers the executive a little further, and normalizes behavior that would once have been shocking. The danger lies in the gradual accumulation of these erosions until the system reaches a tipping point. At that moment, reversing course becomes nearly impossible. Murphy situates this warning within a global context. Around the world, democracies have faltered not through violent overthrows, but through incremental legal and institutional shifts. Parliaments weaken themselves. Courts are stacked with loyalists. Media outlets bend to pressure. Business elites align with the ruling party. Ordinary citizens, preoccupied with daily life, may not notice until it is too late. When critics accuse Murphy of exaggeration, he points to history. Turkey, Russia, Sri Lanka, even the Weimar Republic in Germany, all offer lessons of legislatures surrendering their authority, sometimes willingly, sometimes passively. At the time, many lawmakers dismissed warnings as alarmist. In hindsight, those warnings look prescient. The lesson is clear. By the time the danger is undeniable, it may be irreversible. Murphy's call is not merely a partisan attack, but a plea for institutional integrity. He concedes that Democrats, too, have sometimes enabled executive overreach, particularly in foreign policy. He admits that the nomination process is broken and in need of reform, but he insists that the solution cannot be the wholesale surrender of the Senate's constitutional role. True reform requires bipartisan cooperation, not unilateral rule changes that tip the balance toward the executive. What he asks for ultimately is courage. Courage for senators to resist pressure from their own party's leader. Courage to put institutional responsibility above short-term political gain. Courage to recognize that the true measure of a legislator is not loyalty to a president, but loyalty to the Constitution. The implications of ignoring this call are profound. If the Senate continues down this path, it risks not only diminishing its own power, but endangering the republic itself. Without a legislature willing to stand up to the executive, there are no real checks and balances.
Without oversight, corruption flourishes. Without control of spending, presidents can entrench themselves indefinitely. Without authority over war, decisions of life and death slip from the hands of the people's representatives. Murphy ends with a chilling reminder. None of this is normal. None of it has historical precedent in the United States. And all of it is dangerous, perhaps fatally so if left unchecked. Democracies, he warns, do not often die with dramatic coups or violent revolutions. More often, they vanish quietly, as legislators shrug, institutions bend, and the people adapt to each new erosion as though it were ordinary politics. By the time the final guardrails fall, democracy is already gone. History will not remember the justifications senators give for surrendering their power. It will not remember the tactical advantages gained in one political battle or the partisan calculations made in the heat of the moment. It will only remember that they gave up their role, that they allowed executive power to expand unchecked, that they looked away when democracy needed defenders. Murphy's speech is thus both a warning and a challenge. A warning that America is on a dangerous path of democratic decline, and a challenge for legislators and citizens to resist complacency. The stakes are not about party or policy, but about the survival of self-government itself. Whether or not one agrees with his assessment of specific cases, the broader lesson he draws from history is difficult to ignore. Democracies that fail to defend their institutions are democracies that do not last. Senator Murphy's warning is not just about one vote or one rule. It's about the future of American democracy. Are we witnessing normal politics or the hollowing out of a republic? That's the debate. What do you think? Has Congress given away too much power to the presidency, or is Murphy overstating the threat? Drop your thoughts below.